Welcome to the 308th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome Clark Miller for a discussion of science, technology, globalization, and the pandemic. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @USOFDisaster or @COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, July 12, 2021, there are 4,031,711 deaths globally from COVID-19. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. The United States is reporting 607,156 deaths from COVID-19. India reports 408,764 deaths from the disease, and Brazil is now reporting 533,488 deaths from COVID-19. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline is Harold Lazarus, academic and star economist, dies of COVID-19 at 94. This was written by Joan Gralla and appeared March 28, 2021 in Newsday. Harold Lazarus of Glen Cove, New York, was an unforgettable academic luminary. A noted business researcher at both Hofstra and New York University, whose friends included other star economists, he may be best remembered for his love of teaching, his joie de vivre, and an uncommon willingness to fight for underdogs. He tried to make the textbook come alive, his son Mark recalled. And so whenever we walk through Manhattan, especially the theater district, especially Times Square, like 90% of the time we would bump into someone, usually an admiring former student. His father, who also served on a few dozen company boards, might not recall the student's name, as often is the case when professors are greatly outnumbered by their pupils. Dad would be super friendly, Mark said. People love talking about themselves and they love good listeners. That's one reason he was so loved. Overcoming a childhood stammer may have inspired his father to view humanity so kindly. He definitely had a lot of empathy and compassion just for everyday people, his son said. One of 7 business books Lazarus wrote is titled Human Values in Management. Even before Lazarus had an arm amputated due to cancer, his research partly focused on executives with disabilities, his son recalled. His academic brilliance, which led to friendships with famed economists, including management guru Peter Drucker, was recognized early. Growing up on the Lower East Side, he attended the demanding Townsend Harris and Stuyvesant public schools before joining the Navy as a medic. Though the war was ending and his ship never left the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Lazarus had learned to box, inspired by the prominent Jewish boxers of that era, and he tackled his shipmates who bullied Jewish sailors. He would intervene at his own risk of life and limb, his son said. Earning a bachelor's degree from New York University, Lazarus began teaching full-time at Hofstra in the early 1950s while completing a master's and PhD in economics from Columbia University. At both Hofstra and the New York University Graduate School of Business Administration, where he taught from 1963 to 1973, he was awarded Teacher of the Year. At Columbia, Lazarus stumped one of his professors, who sent him to Bloomingdale's top executives for the answers to his questions. His friends urged him to welcome a new arrival from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, who worked at the store. That was Carol Nunez, who canceled her lunch date to go out with Lazarus. Their son recalled their 36-year marriage, a wonderful one, endured until her death at age 57, he said. At 94, complications from COVID-19 claimed Lazarus's life on February 19th, 2021. Questions were one of the professor's hallmarks. At the 1994 Hamptons International Film Festival, Newsday reported Lazarus asked actor Danny Aiello, who was presenting a 13-minute short film, if allowing people to be poor in our society is worse sin than violence. Former student and Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan, invited to speak at Hofstra, paused on his way to the podium, Mark recalled. He kind of fake punched my dad, leaned down, and said, "Lazarus, no asking those hard questions." It was at NYU that Greenspan, already working as a consultant years earlier, had asked Lazarus to waive a course, Mark recalled. Lazarus, who was very pro-student, instead gave Greenspan books to read. A week or so later, Greenspan correctly answered the questions Lazarus posed and earned course credit. W. Edwards Deming, who is famed for helping Japan rebuild after World War II and who taught at NYU from 1946 to 1993, was another leading economist who became a friend. So did Timothy Costello, who taught at NYU's Graduate School of Business Administration from 1946 until 1965 before becoming a New York City deputy mayor. While sharing an office with Drucker, who taught at NYU Stern from 1950 to 1971, Lazarus once asked him to read a paper before he submitted it for publication, Mark recalled. Drucker asked, "Is this your first draft? You know how I'm considered a great writer?" Mark remembered. "Great writers are not born. They're made from hard work. I turned in my 8th draft," Drucker told Lazarus. This was advice Lazarus took to heart, his son said, recalling his younger brother's tears when his father returned an elementary school paper with an abundance of red ink. It was the Drucker treatment, Mark said. In addition to son Mark and daughter-in-law Anna Lazarus of Rockaway Beach, survivors include son Eric of Staten Island and his girlfriend Sylvia Fischel of Glen Cove. Okay, I'd like to turn to my discussion for today, and let me introduce my guest, Clark Miller. Clark Miller is professor and director of the Center for Energy and Society in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. Clark Miller, thank you so much for making time to join me on COVID Calls today.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here. It's a great show. I won't say enjoyed listening to it over the year, but it's been incredibly informative.
Thank you for that. These are words I still struggle with, using the words fun and enjoy to talk about this kind of work. I wanted to start out the way I usually do, just find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation is looking like there today.
Sure. I mean, I'm in Tempe, Arizona. And we're okay, I think is how I would say about the COVID case today. We've got a uptick going on the last week or so in the case rate. I suspect due to the Delta variant, like everybody else struggling with that. We were down, a month ago or so, and for a little while before that, down in the round of 400 or so cases a day. We're probably back up to 800 or 900 cases a day. New tests coming in positive here. So, compared to some places, that's still quite a lot. Compared to where we were 6 months ago, it's I think a huge relief for all of us that we've settled in at this lower number. We've got about 65% of adults vaccinated here in Arizona, so we're kind of a middle of the road state. We haven't hit that 70% target quite yet, but we're close. I would say for the most part in the last months or so, we've kind of fully reopened. You still see a few people wearing masks in especially in crowded public places, but for the most part, people are behaving as if we're just going to figure out how to live with this thing.
That 65% puts Arizona as a state, as you said, sort of trending towards the better side of things in terms of the overall picture in the United States. But it is a state with mixed government and conservative history, if not present. How's that vaccination debate playing out there? And I'm particularly interested in terms of campus. There have been so many governors and university presidents who've kind of made an issue that vaccination will not be required of students as we go into the fall. Is that drama playing out there in Arizona as well?
in a very modest way. The university put out a statement several weeks ago that we would not require vaccination for students on campus, but that we would strongly encourage it, and that those who were not vaccinated would be expected to continue to participate in our daily health checks and our regular program of random testing, which we instituted as soon as we possibly could a year ago. And the governor thought that was too strong statement, and he then put forth an executive order a few days later saying that none of the universities would be allowed to require vaccination. Wasn't what we were planning to do, but he put it out there, and then followed that up with additional limitations on both collecting information about vaccination status and limiting what could be expected of unvaccinated individuals. So we just have now a series of strongly recommended statements
I see.
about what we're going to do. Our governor has preferred to lead from behind on this particular issue, is kind of how I put it. See where the wind is blowing and kind of follow along. He has not been the he has not been deeply problematic. He's made a number of decisions to go along with, especially with the city leadership in terms of mayors of our big cities, in terms of imposing mask mandates and things like that. He's a businessman. He understands you got to make practical decisions and so forth. But at the same time, he's not been out front in terms of having a strong public policy response, as you would expect in a state like Arizona, where we have a strong conservative history, but it's little c conservative, right? It's small government conservatism, very, very strong here, and therefore, really discouraging of strong public policy responses,
right,
to this kind of event.
Let me ask you, if you don't mind, just about your own experience a little bit. I've been asking guests if they wouldn't mind sharing personal memory, something that they really think defines their time through this pandemic. And I know it's an almost impossible question in some ways, but I wanted to ask it of you anyway.
Yeah, I thought about this question when I saw it on your list, and I said, "Why? What would I respond?" I've been, and my family have been, exceedingly lucky. Over the past year and a half, we've been able to work from home. Our son's been able to do school from home, and so a lot of my memories are of this room right here and inhabiting it for months on end. But we've all stayed healthy, and my extended family has stayed healthy. So I feel incredibly lucky, and just about my own personal experience of this. So let me instead kind of highlight the intellectual and kind of kick us off here, and just say that it's still quite visceral to me. A few weeks in to the emerging pandemic, case numbers were still extremely low, in the less than 10 per state. kind of level, except in maybe Washington and New York and San Francisco, and I mean Seattle, not DC. And even then, though, I had this moment where I was kind of thinking about what I was seeing, and I thought, what, one of the weird things that's happening here is that this thing is not, it's not infecting us simply in a biological sense. It's infecting us as techno-humans, right? And that relationship that we have with technology is changing the way that this pandemic is playing out. Even at those early stages, right? I mean, it was hitching rides on airplanes and covering this. I mean, far faster than we've seen any pandemic in history move from place to place. This thing was moving. It was moving really fast. We saw even early on, we saw disproportionate infection rates in those who were highly exposed to various kinds of air pollution, right? Living in environments shaped by our industrial and technological machinery. And that was changing the way bodies were reacting to the virus and resulting in higher infection rates, higher mortality rates, higher hospitalization rates among those folks. It was infecting industrial workers, right? People who had to go to work because the system wouldn't run if they weren't at work. And so they didn't have a choice. They couldn't stay home. They couldn't work online the way so many of us have been lucky to do. So, I realized that we had something here that was kind of novel, and I've just kept, I just keep seeing things over the last year that remind me time and time again, this thing is different, right? It's infecting us biotechnologically, not just biologically. And I think that's a big deal. And we've not responded to it well in that regard. We've responded to it as a classic public health problem. And it's a distinct form of public health challenge, I think.
Well, there's so much to think about in there, both on one side in terms of the technological systems that come together. You talk about the system that includes everything from the airplane to the factories that are putting PM 2.5 out there in the air and people have it in their lungs. That's a system. I think a lot of people think of those as sort of disconnected pieces of something. You're thinking about it as something that has pieces that are synced. The other part of that I want to ask you about is on the response side of things. And in terms of the fact, first of all, you and I are having this conversation via a medium. It wasn't unknown before COVID for people to have Zoom calls. In my experience, it was generally treated, though, as like, do we really have to do this? It was really a kind of a second-rate kind of thing. It was not the main way you would consider interfacing with people to have a meeting, to share ideas, or to work on a project. And then we slipped into that. It wasn't seamless, and it certainly is for those who had the privilege to do it. But it's there, and when that transition was made. Just one example of, I'm sure, many others that you probably have thought of, in terms of the way our response was also technologically situated, and we haven't examined that quite yet, but it's become part of the pandemic response.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The ability of schools to continue to operate, I think has been remarkable. And it was unbelievably rapid of them to change that, right? We had it here in the US that the school functionally closed in March of 2020. And people didn't know how long it was going to be out. And so the kids, kind of struggled. And basically, they went into read stuff online and then do online homework, and each on their own. And for my son, that was a disaster, because he's not a self-motivated person with respect to his education, and so. He really struggled, and it took a lot of time and work with him to get that done. He never liked homework to begin with, and this was the homework system now taking over everything. But basically, over the summer, the school system here completely retooled, and they transformed everything into Zoom, live Zoom instruction, and they made it work. I have incredible respect for the teachers. And I hope they're sleeping through this summer, because I know it was exhausting for them. And unfortunately, the state extended the school year last year because they were afraid they were going to have days when they couldn't do school. And so they wanted to make sure they got their full 180 days in. And the net result was the kids were in school for like 3.5 weeks longer, and everybody was just totally wiped out by the end. And there were, of course, these other technological things came in, like, not everybody has robust Wi-Fi in their house, right? And so some of the kids were really struggling. And again, the schools adapted, and they actually opened up socially distanced pods in schools for kids who didn't have Wi-Fi at home to come in and do school online in school. It was, the kind of thing you'd never imagine that you would actually do in a reasonable world. But they were trying to figure out, how do you make this work so it's not unequal, right? So that you at least have some hope of having all the kids in the same place. And of course, it also, one of the things that's also clear is that it's made visible how badly learning environments sculpt who's good and who's not in school, right? Because in a classroom, some people learn really well, and others, it's not the right environment for them. Right. Online, other people learn really well, and it's not the right environment for them. And these individualized homework, right? Some kids really great for them, others not at all. And as we've gone through these different modalities, it's become clear, that some of them are better for each kid. And I think our school system is trying to figure out how can we acknowledge and recognize and take advantage of that going forward. So I think they're going to make permanent their digital online school, where they have full-time Zoom instruction, because they realized for some kids it's a much better learning environment than the classroom is. And so we'll see, how it all evolves from here. I think we're all across the board, we're going to be trying to figure out which parts of this digital world that we've created we now bring back into our regular activities and which parts we don't. And it's going to depend. I mean, we're already seeing it with the banks too, right? Half the banks are saying everybody's coming back full time to campus, and the other half of the banks are saying, yeah, we're pretty convinced. A significant fraction of our workforce is never coming back to the bank. So it's really interesting.
It is certainly, and a lot of tech companies have said that as well. Just to come back to something you were saying, I know that disability justice advocates have been very worried in this moment, rightfully so, that for so long they were told, well, we can't possibly make this kind of accommodation for you.
Right.
And then using distance technologies, accommodations were made for whole school districts. So I'm intrigued to hear that that where you are, they've sort of said, well, we kind of keep this bimodal system going because it actually seems to be catering to a certain subset of students. I don't know if that's framed as disability accommodation. It doesn't have to be, but it certainly, to me, is one positive response to a concern that I've heard articulated very well, that people just want to get back to normal. And for most people with disabilities, learning disabilities or mobility disabilities, normal doesn't work.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that's part of what is positive. But they also realize that, it's not just disabilities. And I've written about this, and I know, and many others have as well, that, disabilities are increasingly not the kind of things that we've historically thought of as disabilities, right? So pathological problems with biology, so much as they're infrastructures that are designed so that they work for what we consider a normal human body. And if you don't have that normal human body, then you have lots of problems.
Right.
And it's amazing how deep that runs. And I think we're now learning that learning systems like a classroom function in that same way. For some kids, they're really powerful learning spaces. And for other kids who we've never identified as learning disabled, they're just not working as learning environments for a whole variety of reasons. But of course, it also applies to folks with mobility disabilities and other kinds of learning disabilities, where you can do different things in these online environments.
Just a quick reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Clark Miller today about technology and society and the pandemic. Clark, I want to ask you a question. This is not only for the science, technology, and society scholars out there, but it is also kind of for them. You're the co-editor with Ulrika Felt, Rayvon Fouché, and Laurel Smith-Dorr of the Handbook of Science and Technology Studies, and you've published in the field for a long time, really many important works by yourself and with co-authors. So I wanted to ask you, because I think you have a unique vantage point on this, but how have you seen the field of science, technology, and society research react? And I know academic production is not like calling the fire department. It takes a little time, but there's been a little time now. And so I'm sort of interested what you've seen in terms of trends, scholars or areas of work that were already underway that have picked up a lot of momentum through this time, or other questions that maybe have kind of received less attention in this time. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the most immediate response, and in some ways the most impactful response from the community, has focused on knowledge. Knowledge, of course, is a central element in science, technology, and society scholarship, with a real emphasis on asking, a couple of important questions. How do we make knowledge? How do we know things? And not in a kind of abstract philosophical sense, but in a practical, on the ground, okay, I want to know how this works. How do I go about doing that? What are the practices? What are the routines? What are the ways of thinking that I have to put in place in order to create new knowledge? And then, of course, how do we use knowledge, right? Once we have these purported facts or observations or theories, what do we do with those? And those were, front and center, especially in the early pandemic. And I think it drove a lot of the early scholarship, right? Things like counting. There's always can we call this an event? It's been a year and a half long event. I don't know. There's always a jillion things to count. There's a jillion ways to count them and a jillion ways to report those counts. And we've seen every conceivable variant of that, I think, over the last year and a half. And a lot of really interesting thinking from the STS community about that. and a lot of valuable insights in kind of that I think hopefully we'll be able to reflect on and systematize and maybe put out there in a compelling way for the public health community, for public administrators. Okay, so this is what we've kind of learned about the challenge of trying to put in place useful counting systems for people, for counting things like cases, and for counting things like tests, for counting things like deaths. And of course, what are the limitations of any particular strategy for trying to count? Same thing goes for testing, right? Testing is another thing that STS has historically written a lot about. And of course, there were different tests early on for COVID, available in different places to different kinds of communities. Lots of innovation happening out there in biotech firms and other kinds of hospitals, and even in our research facility here. We had a big research facility on campus who early on said to the president, look, we can build a giant testing facility and we can test the ASU community and we can make it available more broadly. And they did it, they built it. And we've been testing, tens of thousands of people on a very rapid basis here with a test. It's a saliva-based test. So you spit into a test tube and it's just really simple. And so, that kind of bottom-up innovation that was happening all over different industries, building different tests, and then trying to figure out how to deploy those tests in a meaningful way. But in reflecting all that, right, both the counting that we do, you mentioned the Johns Hopkins website that very early on started putting out data on how many cases there were, and also with the testing regimes. One of the things I will say is we never developed, and I'm not sure whether this happened anywhere else. I mean, there were apps developed in other countries. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much they ultimately got used. But here in the US, we never developed a knowledge capability that allowed everyday people to get a handle on what was going on. And I find that fascinating. Ultimately, it devolved to masks, right? The presence of a mask on somebody else's face became an indicator of whether they were taking it seriously or not. And therefore, if you were on one side of the camp and on the other side, it became an indicator of whether you'd been brainwashed, right? But that visible signal in a social environment was the only information we had to go on in making day-to-day decisions. And it just seems to me a massive failure of our public knowledge-making enterprises, that's the best that we could do, right? In terms of helping inform people how to stay safe in their day-to-day interactions. We've had 18 months. We've developed umpteen bazillion different kinds of testing for this thing. We've developed half a dozen major vaccines. We've spent bazillions of dollars doing all of that. And in none of those cases did we ultimately manage to inform everyday citizens, like with useful knowledge that they could put to work in their daily choices. And that to me is a massive failure, public knowledge-making failure. And I think has contributed to why this thing has so disrupted our society, right? And been so disruptive, not just at the level of, high-level public controversies, but the level of people feeling unsecure in their day-to-day lives.
So much in there, and I'm glad you started with and I couldn't agree with you more about the STS contribution on knowledge making and the counting aspect and the testing. aspect. I read the daily count that comes from Johns Hopkins and other sources, and I spare the listener what's going on in my head, which is I'm reading you this number with huge reservations. And sometimes I will even read a story after which challenges the count, and not to be meta, but just to show what's out there, which is that the count is authoritative and moves quickly into visualization and through the media. And we have seen, I think, I would say we've seen, certainly in Western press, pretty significant pushing back on the count, or questioning and talking about an undercount. This has been big in India. But that, even just to describe that to you just now, took me 45 seconds. I mean, it's not a fast discussion. And then go one level deeper into it and get into how public health reporting works and the cost that it takes to come up with a number. That's where I wonder, you're saying this is a place where STS has made and could continue to make a contribution to public health. I feel like that's one of those areas where the kinds of research that STS scholars do about how numbers are produced and how they gain traction out there, that can be a contribution, should be a contribution.
I agree. I think it should be. I think one of the challenges it's a challenge of our field that we take simple things like that and unpack them, and that takes time. And I think the lessons that we learn from this are going to take time, and I hope that we infrastructure that effort to draw lessons from this. I don't know who would fund it, but I've been participating for the last year in a National Academies study of how do we accelerate the clean energy transition. And I got to tell you, having read many of these reports over the years and always wondered, okay, what is it like to be on one? It's actually quite a remarkable experience, and it's an incredibly valuable exercise to bring together 15 to 20 really knowledgeable people on a topic, and over the course of a year, ask them to synthesize what's known about it. And in this particular instance, I think there could be a huge amount of value if we were to take these people who know this stuff in detail about counting and about testing and about how we make public health knowledge valuable and useful for different kinds of agencies and institutions, and ask them to put together a synthesis of what we've learned over the last year. I think it could be hugely useful for the next time that we have to deal with something like this.
I want to return to this question of investigation in a moment, but there's one other thing you said that was really compelling, and I wanted to ask you about it. This issue of making knowledge available in a format for average folks to use in the pandemic, particularly in the United States. I'm thinking here of apps that were available. I'm in South Korea, made available here, using social media platforms and particular sort of bespoke apps. This was also done in Singapore and Taiwan, to do contact tracing, to let people know, even if they'd come into close proximity of someone who had tested positive. And that presumes a sort of a complex array of things that are happening in the public health space. Like, for example, testing is happening and those numbers are being kept. Still, I've thought a lot about that, in that the discourse in the United States around that very quickly closed on the idea that Americans just won't do that. I heard that so many times. Americans just won't give up that kind of information about themselves, and so just forget it. And I hear that, and I go look at Facebook. I'm like, Americans will give up a lot of information about themselves.
Yes.
So I'm not compelled by that answer. That seems like there was, I wonder what you think about it. It's a huge topic, but I just wanted to get your sense of that. Is it just that there was no technological momentum for those kinds of apps and they would have had to start from nothing? Or do you have any working theories about why that didn't catch on in the US? Because I agree, it would have been pretty impactful.
I think that I don't have, I have not thought through the question of why that didn't happen here. My initial thought on that would be that we had 50 public health systems, not one. And of course, that's an ordinary feature of the American political landscape. But we are really used to a centralized action on the part of the Centers for Disease Control. And when that got disrupted in this particular context, I think it left state public health departments reeling, trying to figure out how to do this on their own. I think a comparative analysis of state public health department reporting of counts and tests and stuff like that would be potentially really interesting, especially if it tracked their development over time. I mean, I'm used to looking at the Arizona one. I have no idea what the others looked like, but I know that ours evolved in a very particular context around a very particular set of issues, and they made some real choices about what to present and what not to present. And they did so with essentially no federal guidance about what they should be doing. And I think in that context, I mean, you certainly could have seen app makers take advantage of that. But I think they're so used to operating on a scale that is everybody, right? If you think about a Facebook, an Apple, they don't have a capacity to do 50 different responses for 50 different states. It's just not in their mindset to be organized in that way, right? I mean, Facebook, yeah, it's got all these groups that are divided up, and any social network does, where it's broken up into different organizations, but it's definitely not by state.
Right.
And so that, I'm absolutely confident that the development of apps like that would have taken coordination with some sort of governmental actor to bring them into being. I mean, if only because the governmental actors were the ones doing the contact tracing. I mean, again, these right. entities don't have the capacity to do contact tracing, right? Think about it. Facebook, it's a tiny organization in terms of the number of people. It's just the way that that platform model in Silicon Valley works. It's not about building up the human capacities to do things, and so it relies entirely on, the voluntary contribution of labor and or government data, right? Being able to access something that somebody else is doing. You said earlier, this knowledge is really expensive. It's hugely expensive to do this kind of stuff. You have to have lots of people doing the work of producing these kinds of knowledges. If you think about the testing schemes that got set up and the amount of labor that went into doing tests, collecting test results, sharing those results with the state website, compiling and aggregating all of that information on the state website. It's a huge undertaking. And so that would be my hypothesis. There's just a mismatch between the different kinds of technological and governmental organizations for moving knowledge around.
I'd like to circle back on this knowledge production issue for a second and actually bring that into the sort of domain of the public square. Do you expect investigations of COVID? And if so, what type? I mean, you talked about the national academies as one mode of investigating a pressing social problem. I think a lot of times they try to stay ahead of those problems, or at least on the wave of those problems, like energy transition, the one you talked about. Mm-hmm. Seems like we do need organized ways to learn so many things about COVID in a time-sensitive way. I try to track that. I see murmurings, but I haven't seen much that's concrete yet. I wonder what you think about it.
No, I haven't either. Um, I think there's too many things going on simultaneously right now. I mean, big things. And so, I think we'll see that happen. I think we'll see studies being done. I think we'll see reports being written, but they will be of the more ordinary kind. The CDC will do a review and lessons learned kind of thing and so forth. I think we'll see that, but I think it will be of the ordinary bureaucratic kind, and not at least here, not the kind of big. What happened and how do we make sense of it kind of thing. I wouldn't be surprised if we did at some point see a National Academy study of some sort, but I doubt of the kind that I described.
You don't think?
I would love to see the STS community figure out how to do it on their own, because I do think it's the kind of thing that I think our community is now mature enough that we have networks of people who know enormous amounts. We have a capacity to do research that's certainly unprecedented in our community's time, and that research reveals things that no other fields are revealing. And so I think that it's worth our time to start thinking about how we could do some of that work ourselves, and where we could get money to do it, because it's not going to be free. Right. But I think we could potentially start to persuade different kinds of funding entities that kind of synthesis would be valuable.
It's a really interesting idea, and not strange in the realm of engineering. For example, after major structural disasters, various different engineering societies in the United States and abroad publish their own investigative reports. That's pretty normal.
Absolutely.
A lot of times they just duplicate what happens in congressional studies, and they don't seem to have any problem doing that. It serves their own professional interests. And it's not just CYA. A lot of times, I've read a lot of those reports, and some of them do they break stories. They make new knowledge out of those. And one thing that's often overlooked is they bring together configurations of researchers which tee up possibilities for future work. You can tell I'm enthusiastic about this idea. I wonder what it would look like for the STS community to do that, because it would be moving into a space that's outside the halls of the academy. You'd be wading into the court of public opinion on that kind of thing. You think it could actually be done?
Absolutely. I think 4S, I think its European counterpart, could easily decide that this was a topic worth pursuing, and institutional. I mean, look, we've got, there's still significant support at NSF for our field. And you could take a $500,000 proposal to the STS program at NSF. We've got a member of our community who's now the deputy director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. You could take a proposal to her and say, this should be done. It would be valuable. And can we figure out where the money would come from in the federal government to see something like that done? As you say, other fields do it all the time. I was part of a project that got a little 30 years ago, and that got a little bit of seed money from NSF, and then got multiple millions more from from NOAA and the Department of Commerce and at least one other federal agency to expand the research, just because there were people who were interested in other agencies. So I would be quite, and the Europeans are better at this than we are. There have been, reports from the STS community on the Knowledge Society, for example, coming out of, funded by the European Union. The European Professoriate is closer to the public administration than American academia has been in recent decades. So I think you could see something happen there too. It'd be great if it was joint, some sort of international effort.
Mm-hmm. You heard it here first, folks, an STS COVID investigation. So just a quick reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Clark Miller today about technology and infrastructure in the pandemic. And I promised infrastructure, so let's get to that. And maybe just start with a kind of a general question for you about infrastructure. First of all, lessons that we can learn about COVID by understanding infrastructure design. You talked about that at the top a little bit in terms of the sort of techno-human and the degrees to which technology sort of frames everything about this pandemic. But just to go a little further with that, what's worked and what hasn't in terms of the infrastructure systems that we have throughout this time, and that also sort of points to a set of questions around transitions that are possible, and how COVID might be a bit of a catalyst for some of those transitions. So it's the big infrastructure question, I guess. I'd like you to sort of pick it up wherever you want to, Clark. You think deeply about these issues.
Yeah. I think what I started to say earlier goes in really important ways. Infrastructure, in some sense, is a powerful organizer of the contemporary world. And that goes right down to our biology. Human biology today is not what it was 100 years ago, let alone 500 years ago, right? We're different creatures biologically than we were. And all of that is a result of our infrastructures, our food infrastructures, our water infrastructures, our engineered infrastructures, the kinds of chemical environments that those infrastructures create for us today. The biological exchanges that we have and the things that come with them, right? We breathe stuff in and out, we drink water, we eat food, and along with that comes all kinds of other stuff. And that has shaped the composition of our food is radically different today than it was, a few hundred years ago. And that means our bodies are different because we're building them out of different building blocks. And we saw that in COVID in lots and lots of ways. I still, we talked about the inequality in terms of people whose lungs had been impacted by PM 2.5. We saw it in lots of other ways, right? Workers who worked in these industrial processes. There was a period of time where meat was unbelievably scarce in the United States because we were having massive outbreaks of COVID-19 among meat packers, right? The people working in these critical facilities where all the meat comes together, gets processed, and then gets shipped out into the supply chains. At these nodes, there are people, and those people were working in particular configurations in relationship to the machinery. And as a result of those configurations, they were passing COVID back and forth with each other and getting sick. And then that meant that the plants were either being closed because of sickness or they weren't working at full efficiency or whatever, right? And it was just illustrating this relationship that we have with these machineries. And so when you think about, but then, think about the other end of it, right? What worked? Well, what works in health delivery is in a sense what has always worked. That is to say, I shouldn't say always, but at least in the last century, what has worked. Short-term technological interventions that deliver immediate health outcomes, right? You can take a pill for it. You can get a shot for it. You can put a cast on it. You can have surgery for it. If you can do that kind of short-term technical intervention, then you can fix it, right? But what doesn't work? To COVID, right? These enduring problems that people are having with this disease. We don't have a clue how to deal with those in the system. We jumped on this idea of a vaccine because we know how to do that. And we left aside all kinds of other things that were much harder, much more complicated problems to kind of grapple with along the way. And that put us 12 months behind this thing, right? In a really kind of serious way. And we have these kind of problems all throughout our health system. It's almost impossible in today's food systems, at least as they manifest in the United States, right? The kinds of food that are available to people at the prices that they're available. It's almost impossible for you to live with diabetes in today's food system, right? Because it's not something you can give somebody a short-term intervention for, right? There is no pill, there is no vaccine, you have to manage your diet. And well, managing your diet when the whole food system is designed to give you sugar and flour just is a non-starter. Right. And I think you talk about these transitions. This is really both the opportunity and the challenge. We've built systems that are unsustainable. The energy system and its consumption of fossil fuels, which produce carbon dioxide, which are now driving the Earth's climate system off a cliff, right? That is just simply unsustainable at its root, right? You've got to differently configure global energy systems if we have a hope of being sustainable. The food system and the growth in carbohydrate-based diets is unsustainable from a health standpoint. We've got to fundamentally reconfigure how we think about and organize the production and consumption and transport and distribution of food in the United States. So we've got to figure out how to do these massive transitions in these infrastructures, which embed all kinds of, political economies, to put it most starkly, right? Organization of power and wealth is built up in relationship to these systems, which means at the same time that they're unsustainable from a health standpoint or from an environmental standpoint, they're also deeply unjust and deeply unequal in the kinds of outcomes that they create in the world. And I've come to, I think, in some sense, be very unhappy with the trajectory of a lot of scholarship that seems to want to argue that capitalism is the root of all inequality and the root of all evil. When I look at what's happening and I say, these infrastructure systems that we've got are pervasively distributing inequality, and they're not separate from capitalism, but it's not, in a sense, capitalism by itself that's the problem. I mean, it's not as if other countries that followed other ideologies didn't produce just as big and massive systems that were just as unsustainable. So there's something about our relationship with technology that we've also got to figure out how to fix. And the problem is we've built these massive infrastructures with embedded costs, right? We've sunk costs. We've invested trillions of dollars in building these infrastructures. They're unbelievably efficient in many respects, which means that if you try to do something different, you create inefficiencies, which then translate into higher costs for folks. They're absolutely critical for survival. I mean, most of us wouldn't know how to get food except from the grocery store, period.
Right.
And so you can't mess with them while you're fixing them.
Right.
we got to figure out how to do this transition in place with everybody secure along the way. But the opportunity to design different kinds of infrastructures that generate better outcomes, better distributions of outcomes is huge. Our work with solar energy is really interesting here. We've got this kind of project where we ask, well, so what are the opportunities, the design opportunities, if you will, mm-hmm. if we powered half the world's energy system with solar energy? Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out it's a really interesting problem because solar energy comes packaged in a panel. It's a couple of meters by a meter panel, and that unit is actually unbelievably flexible, right? To go back to STS, Trevor Pinch's idea of interpretive flexibility, Viva Biker and those guys, this idea of well, you could arrange that panel in lots of different ways. Turns out to be absolutely true. We are arranging solar energy already on the planet in everything from calculators and lanterns all the way up to giant utility scale power plants. The ownership of those is structured in radically different ways. There's lots of ways you can do solar. And so, you think about what the opportunity is to, for example, distribute ownership more equally, right? The fossil fuel industry is one of the most concentrated industries in terms of ownership on the planet. It drives inequality in income and wealth as a result of who owns and how they extract and exploit those resources, and where the monies flow. I mean, the ordinary American, $2,000 a year goes to buy carbon-based fuels. Yeah. That's a huge flow of capital. Right? So if you could organize the distribution of ownership of these solar panels in a different way so that it wasn't highly concentrated, you could do some pretty amazing things in terms of kind of rethinking how we interact with and our energy systems and what those political economies look like. But it's really hard to kind of break out of that kind of conventional way of thinking about these systems that comes along with the way they're currently organized.
Just to follow up, you pointed to a real signal problem here, which is, the individual, and you ask them, well, okay, let's change the system. And like you said, they're like, well, okay, I'm one person and it's a really complicated array of things. And that's just the tech side, not to mention the financial side and every other piece of it. And so you do have this problem of the individual and the structural to deal with. But then here comes the pandemic. And a lot of that, I should just say, to bracket this, a lot of pessimism, I think, has accumulated around climate and climate action in that regard. People across the political spectrum, really, and around the world have said, yeah, action is necessary. But what can one person or even a small group of people actually do about it? And then here comes the pandemic and the whole world locks down. Those who can, but pretty impressive collective action, I have to say, from March into May of 2020, not something I expected to ever see in my lifetime. Now, I don't want to make too much of it necessarily, but it did show how an existential global problem materialized and action was taken that was really pretty structural. It involved people, but it involved big groups of people working to make a change, and it saved lives. And I think sometimes what it felt like to me was like people I don't know are doing something that's inconvenient to try to save my life. And they're doing it, in other countries. I feel like we should do more with that. Maybe it speaks back to your issue of how this sort of infrastructure transitions can work and what's the political base or even just the human psychological basis for participating in something like that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great example and points to something that I've observed over the last 10 years as I've kind of moved from, I spent my early career doing a lot of work on climate change. And eventually I got fed up with the argument about whether climate change was real or not. And I decided to spend my time working instead on energy transitions, and arguing that was kind of what centrally we had to do was change the way we produce and consume energy. And what I've observed over the last decade is the energy system is doing that work in the same way that you described for COVID. It's been slower, but in some ways it's also, but it's happening, right? And I don't think we recognize just how hard a problem it is to wrap your head around. I deliver electricity. If I'm an electric utility, for example, I deliver electricity here in Arizona, for example, to 2 million people and a whole bunch of businesses and industries, and I do it 24/7, 365. And that system works, and it works unbelievably reliably. And now you're saying, I don't get to use 75% of the technologies that I've used in the past to do that anymore. But I don't get to shut down and reconfigure. I got to do this while I'm flying the airplane. I got to figure out how to change out the motor while I'm flying the airplane. And it's just a huge, right. just to wrap your head around, okay, I'm going to do this, let alone how am I going to do it, but just to commit yourself to do it. But I think the industry has made that commitment by and large. There are still those for whom you ask whether they really have or not, but there's a huge amount of movement happening inside the industry. The challenge is, and this is where COVID-19 differs, is that the industry has never, in its 150-year history, viewed the public as a part and parcel of the conversation about how to do this. And so that public imagination of transition and transformation as at best has been seen as something to be manipulated in the political sphere. And I think it's a limitation. We've certainly seen that in Puerto Rico, where there's a huge appetite among the public in the wake of Hurricane Maria and Irma, and the disaster that was the energy system destruction that followed those for almost a year. People want not to have that happen again. And they've become convinced that solar energy is the way to do that. But it's a poor place, and solar is still expensive, especially when you add batteries, which is what they have to have in order to make it work as a kind of alternative to, say, a generator that you would buy and put in your garage. And so there's I call it an imaginary, right? They believe that solar energy is the future of Puerto Rico's energy system all over that island. Deep conviction. Almost no policy, business, market, utility response to that, right? That would try to channel that imagination, channel that energy, channel that willingness to pay, to put it in economic terms, for something different, and figure out how to mobilize around it and really move. So that's part of what we've been trying to do, is try to think about how do we get the energy community to recognize that mobilizing public imagination can be a powerful force to help them change. Of course, then that comes with constraints. The public is going to have ideas about where it wants to go, and they'll have to take those seriously, but which I understand they're a little leery about.
Yeah, when you turn imagination loose, you can't exactly constrain it. But
Right.
we're almost up on time, but I actually did want to use this as an opportunity to talk about one of the many projects you're working on, and I think it speaks directly to this issue, which is a project called Cities of Light, a collection of solar futures. It seems to me, so this is, well, tell us about it, but it seems to me this is one quite really innovative, but also just holds out a lot of promise for how people who want to try to introduce new ideas around infrastructure change. And I think this is applicable to COVID. So how do you imagine a different world, right?
Right.
And so don't necessarily just leave that to the academics who can imagine it, and then we talk about it and we write really dry papers for each other about it.
Right.
But leave it to the professionals who imagine things and then bring it to us in the written word or on the screen. So this is a work of fiction about energy futures, right?
Yeah, Cities of Light is, it's actually the second in a series of volumes that we've been doing in collaboration with artists and writers. They're free to download from the internet. So if you Google Cities of Light or The Weight of Light, you can go and you can download an electronic copy, or you can purchase a print-on-demand copy if you want. They're really a response to something we realized early on in our thinking about energy transitions, which is almost all the discussion about energy is focused on the technology. And that's okay when you're in a system or an infrastructure and you're just making minor incremental changes to that infrastructure over time. But if you're going to reconfigure the whole thing, then you're going to reconfigure people's lives at the same time in big ways and in little ways. And so you have to figure out how to bring the people into the conversation. We've figured out lots of ways to do that, but this one's particularly interesting because we realize that science fiction does that, right? It takes a story about technology, but it centers the people. All fiction, all storytelling centers people. And it centers individual people with all of their wants, their needs, their hates, their desires, right, as front and center in what drives the story. And so we wanted to bring that idea into thinking about the energy transition. And then we wanted to also, just really take advantage of this opportunity. I mean, we've never before taken an infrastructure of this scale and change and tried to scale and scope and seriousness and tried to change it. And so there's this question, what do we change it to? And what are the opportunities there? And so we wanted to give people an opportunity to kind of explore potential futures that we might create. And so we worked with, some amazing science fiction writers, artists, others who can help capture and engage the imagination in really innovative and creative ways. And it's really all about doing what you asked at the very beginning, which is how do we make STS speak to these big issues? And for me, it really has come down to, and I know some people don't like this, but it's really come down to the idea that there are always alternative designs for infrastructures. And what I think we can do as STS scholars is open up the design imagination around new technologies and new infrastructures, and help people realize that on the one hand, it could be designed differently than it is. And on the other hand, that with any design choice that you make, and it's not like there are, this is true of some designs, but not others. It's true of every design choice you might make. There are consequences for how people are going to live their lives in the future if you make that choice, as opposed to this other choice. So you're always trading off on different ways of living in the future for people at the same time that you're trading off on different ways of organizing the infrastructures. And so these books are really about trying to bring those choices front and center, right? So do we build solar energy big, utility scale power plants? Do we build it small in, at the household scale? Do we create community centered designs? Do we build it beautiful, or do we build it with an engineering aesthetic, right? Do we distribute ownership? Do we concentrate on centralized ownership? These are very real infrastructure choices that have outcomes that will flow with them. And we think we should be incorporating all of that outcome, all of those outcomes as part of the conversation about where to go.
Just want to remind everyone you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls most weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join me tomorrow for a Researchers Roundtable. We're long overdue for a Researchers Roundtable. I'll have Tanya Corbin, Philip Vostal, and Summer Marion on to talk about disaster research and their various different fascinating research projects that they have ongoing. And just to take a moment here to thank Clark Miller. I knew this would be a wide-ranging conversation, and it even far surpassed what I expected. Clark, I'm thrilled to hear about the work you're doing, and thanks for really reflecting on the many different parts of it in the context of COVID. Learned a lot in the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Scott. Real tremendous opportunity and privilege to be here and have a chance to talk to you about these topics.
We'll bring you back in a few months, I hope.
That'd be great.
Good. Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time.